Good morning, dear participants of the forum. My name is Rahim Ashakbayev, and I'm happy to moderate the second session of our first Forum for Sustainable Development Goals. So we're going to discuss how sustainable development goals can support the economic growth and economic development. And first of all, let me introduce our panel speakers. Mirjana Spolaric-Egger, Director of the UNDP Regional Bureau for Europe and the CIS. Tatiana Nemtson, Chairman, Development Fund of Social Significant Initiatives. Mr. Hakur Hartson, Founder and Chairman of the company Arctic Green Energy. And Dinara Sejaparova, Financial Director, Almaty International Airport. Because our audience is mostly Russian-speaking, let me switch to Russian. Сказать, что тема
saying that the sustainable development topic is extremely relevant for all the countries, in particular when we hear in Kazakhstan that we are discussing the issues of inequality and poverty. We are discussing a number of issues related to environment. It seems that this agenda is absolutely relevant for us. Yesterday we had a great session. However, I believe that without our second session, there will be something missing in our presentations. I liked very much the presentation by Ms. Christine Lagarde, where she talked a lot about the sustainable development, inclusive development, but at the same time, we rather measured the issues related to the GDP growth. But thanks a lot for the fact that we have a UN that has significantly contributed to the global discussion of what is the sustainable growth, sustainable development. We also have the OECD that also defines inclusive growth, and compared to probably IMF would provide specific measurements and indicators and specific recipes.
And I would like to remind you of the statement of our first president, Nur-Sultan 2 years ago during Astana Economic Forum, in which, from my point of view, very correctly and clearly he defined the problem of a certain contradiction of the actual indicator that the majority of the countries are using, which is GDP. And yesterday we've heard from IMF that world growth is slowing down and that we probably have to reach it maybe at a slower pace. But nevertheless, Nur-Sultan Nazarbayev mentioned that GDP does not reflect the long-term character of economic activity, and it does not show the real well-being. And it took place in June 2017. And we were really very happy to hear that at the beginning of 2018, in January, this topic was also followed on by the World Economic Forum, and the press release on the indicators of inclusive development was pretty tough on these issues as well, and focus on GDP fueling inequality and short-termism. This is exactly what we were discussing during the first session, because the focus on GDP does not enable us to achieve sustainable development goals, and it only causes inequality. During the World Economic Forum, some other indicators were proposed, such as inclusive index, and there are some other OECD indexes. There are 11 of those, and our country Kazakhstan is trying to achieve them. But at the same time, when we talk about and we hear about inclusive and sustainable economic growth, we believe that we are a little bit confused. And to resolve this problem, in spite of our understanding that there are some global issues under discussion, nevertheless, I hope that our discussion will also contribute to the resolution of these problems. And my first question will be for Director of Regional UN Development Programs, Ms. Mirjana Egger. Do you think that in spite of the great contribution that SDG paradigm is introducing in the fight against inequality and other problems, but nevertheless it has not become mainstream. And what else can countries do to replace the economic growth paradigm with SDG paradigm?
Thank you very much. And first of all, let me thank you for having the opportunity to have, participate in this very important first Kazakhstan Forum on Sustainable Development. I think the fact that the government has put this so prominently on the agenda of the Astana Economic Forum shows its commitment to sustainable development, and I wanted to comment that at the outset. Now, let me start by saying that the Agenda 2030, or the 17 development goals that pertain to it, are indivisible. You won't be able to achieve sustainable development if you take one goal at a time, and you will not be able to achieve sustainable development if you don't implement the agenda across all levels of society and across all levels of governance down to the municipal level. What we heard yesterday and what we will continue to hear today is most relevant. This is not something for diplomats, and Jeffrey Sachs said it as well. This is for the whole of society. And I think as long as we haven't achieved to communicate the Sustainable Development Agenda in a way that everybody understands it and that everybody thinks this is his and hers, we haven't really done our job right. So we will have to improve much about that in the future. But let me talk about now the most pressing issues when we talk about sustainable development. And one, that is very important, is definitely tackling inequalities. The problem about inequalities, and most governments nowadays are seized with this issue and trying to figure out how to reduce inequalities. The problem with it is that in the past we've always looked at disparities in income. We haven't enough thought about looking at disparities in health, in education, in gender, in access to technologies, and in exposure to economic or climate-related shocks. This will have to change, but our measurements are not ready to do that. So what UNDP will do later in the year is publishing a report, or the next signature human development report on inequalities that will precisely speak about how we measure inequalities in the future. We will have to look at institutional development eventually. We will not be able to tackle inequalities even if once we have measured them, if we don't accept the fact that this pertains to institutional development, that tackling inequalities pertains to having strong social protection schemes to offset some of the negative implications of the positive influence of technological innovation, for instance. And this leads me to the second point. I mean, technological advancement bears huge opportunities to accelerate sustainable development, but we all know that it will make jobs disappear. So again, we need strong institutions, good and transparent, inclusive governance systems that will ensure that there will be mechanisms in place that will offset these negative effects for society in the future and not increase disparities in the society. Because what happens when we have inequalities? It undermines good governance at the end of the if inequalities become too big. And it undermines democracy, it undermines economic growth. And we already know today that if we included women fully into the labor market, we would have better economic productivity. So sustainable development is, at the end of the day, about inclusive economic growth and about better economic growth. And we know at UNDP, based on our research today, that there's no discrepancy between tackling inequalities and reducing inequalities and improving economic growth for everybody. last but not least, we have to talk about financing of development. If we tackle inequalities and have strong social protection schemes, we have to know where this money is coming from. What UNDP is working on is to define mechanisms and to help the government establish platforms that would allow it to better coordinate between line ministries in order to ensure that the Agenda 2030 is nationalized and localized at an adequate pace, that the government is in a good position to identify the accelerators for sustainable development according to context, and that the government is able to measure where the money comes from and where it goes, to also be able to know where sustainable development, or in which areas the sustainable development at the national level is underfinanced. So let me close again by saying that we have to tackle everything at the same time, as complicated as it sounds. And because it is complicated, we have to invest more in making the society understand what development is and what sustainable development means for them and for their daily lives and for the prosperity of their children in the future. And I'm very thankful to the Asian Development Bank and to the government of Kazakhstan, because we are just now establishing a platform to help improve coordination at the national level, to help improve mainstreaming at the national level of the SDGs, and to help improve tackling finance flows and channeling them to the right direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mirjana. As it was discussed in the first session, so the only country which fully adopted Sustainable Development Goals is Sweden. And we see when it comes to the real policy-making level, politicians, they are under pressure of the public opinion, so they are pursuing short-term goals to creating jobs. And I see kind of the contradiction between this agenda and what we see in the countries, so which the politicians, they are happy to talk about inclusive sustainable growth, but reluctant to take these indicators as then policy goals. Do you agree?
Thank you. It's not a one-way street. I mean, governments are accountable to implementing, but citizens also have to make their governments accountable for what they have promised them. And the Agenda 2030 was adopted by all member states collectively. They have all subscribed to it. So it's now to the citizens of each country also to demand that these development goals be implemented at the national level.
Thank you. Мое предположение, что, возможно,
I believe that probably there will be some positive pressure on the level of policymakers that has to be started with raising awareness of the public about the need of achieving a very well-balanced inclusive economic growth, and then this kind of demand through electorate will reach the state governance. Tatiana, I came across the ideas that there is a certain criticism of sustainable development paradigm because it only creates an illusion that sustainable development is achievable. And the latest data from the climate change panel is showing that there are some certain processes of temperature growth are irreversible, and to mitigate the effect of climate change, which is growing let's say, in a very threshold manner, because after a certain accumulation of temperature, then there is a sharp change, and probably we have to talk about the anti-growth tendency, about the drop down of the economic growth. So I'm very much interested to hear from you about the climate change in terms of this sustainable development paradigm. Thank you very much. I believe that this question is really very interesting. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you on behalf of the chairman of the Presidium of Association of Environmental Organizations of Kazakhstan, Ms. Aliya Nazarbayeva, and let me express some of my ideas on this particular issue. As a matter of fact, I would like to state that today the forum is a very strong and constructive platform which enables us to unite people from all over the world, and I do agree, fully agree with the speakers of the first session. And I was listening to them and thinking that very successful and progressive experience that has already been achieved in other countries is very important for Kazakhstan for different reasons. Of course, we can talk about the global warming problem, consequences associated with it. And I believe that every person today understands very well these issues, because what seemed to be 10 years ago pretty difficult to realize, I believe that now every citizen of the world can feel it, can feel these changes on their family members, changes in the society, and therefore we have to really promote the environmental culture. And I would like to say that the society here in Kazakhstan is ready for pretty targeted movement and progress towards SDG achievement. First of all, we have already established the public platform, which is called Planet, which enables the representatives of NGOs, scientists, business people, and government to sit down at the same table and to develop a unified strategy and program that can be applied in the society. Secondly, what is working very well here is the mechanism of the UNDP programs, because jointly with UNDP we initiated and implemented a lot of initiatives aiming at the unification of people living in various regions of the country, and to promote the issues of energy saving, sustainable development, educational programs on green technologies. And it really brings a lot of positive effect. Being a teacher and who dedicated 32 years of my life to education, I think that we have to start talking about these issues with very small children, starting the initial grades at school. And the fund, our fund, is ready to start working very seriously on the formation of environmental culture. And we are very happy that the Ministry of Education jointly with UNDP has already started such efforts. And we are ready also to support such initiatives. And I would like to voice one more proposal, because in Kazakhstan today we have already established an international green technology center, which is supposed to become a platform which will bring together business and public society, the scientists and intelligentsia to promote the international experience. In addition, what is really very relevant and important is to monitor this work jointly with such layer of our society as the parents, because through parents we can deliver to the children the best international practices. And in this sense, we also have a very positive experience of cooperation with UNDP. In addition, public associations in the country should work out the mechanism on the basis of which every citizen of Kazakhstan will be involved into the resolution of social problems, efficient and energy-saving technologies, as well as correct understanding of the strategic goals that will bring down the crisis situations caused by climate change. We are participants of Environmental Educational Organizations Association, and it consists of more than 100 organizations. And now we have a very good, well-working and streamlined mechanism of cooperation that is working on different levels. That's why I believe that it's high time today to launch the mechanism of environmental control, signing of memorandum, and the public sector should also be very actively involved into our undertakings. At the same time, I would like to say that the Astana Economic Forum platform is also a very good example of how we can join all together in our efforts of achieving SDG. There are 17 SDGs, but I believe that every one of us will have to perceive correctly the idea that a human being should be very sustainable in his or her life, and probably it's necessary for us to pay a visit to Sweden, but at the same time you have to be very cautious about the available natural resources, and we have to pass this message across to the young guys of how to build up their life model for the future. Thank you very much, Tatiana. I understand that you are pretty satisfied with progress achieved in Kazakhstan on SDG. Well, I believe that the process has just been launched. We are just at the beginning of this very long way, and we cannot be always satisfied. There is some satisfaction, however, at the same time, there is also a very strong desire to do something, to change something. Therefore, we have to consolidate not only our public society, but also our educational facilities to work jointly on SDGs. Thank you. Mr. Harderson, could you...
Your view on how to achieve sustainable development goals, especially in the developing countries like Kazakhstan?
Yes, thank you so much. I'm going to share with you how we would do it based on our experience in Iceland with geothermal energy and how it can transform countries. Iceland was the first country in the world to achieve 100% of its primary energy generation from renewables. And I believe now Costa Rica has joined us. The secret ingredient in this success was low temperature geothermal energy that is quite common all over the world, unlike high temperature geothermal. The biggest energy challenge we are facing in the world today is the heating and cooling of our cities. Around half of all energy that is generated around the world is for the creation of heat. And most of this is for heating and cooling of the cities. And about 80% of heat for heating and cooling cities is generated from fossil fuels. So if we can solve the problem of how to heat and cool cities without the fossil fuels and do it profitably, we have taken down a significant part of the air pollution and environmental and public health damage that we are faced with today. In about 10 years' time, 5 billion people will be living in cities around the world, 70% of the world's population. And in spite of the tremendous progress that renewable energies have made in terms of being a percentage of the energy mix, heating and cooling of cities has been left behind because it requires baseload energy. So solar and wind cannot contribute too much when it comes to heating and cooling because there is no batteries inside that can serve a whole town or whole cities. Geothermal, on the other hand, is the only renewable energy that is baseload. It is always on, and therefore it's ideal to solve the heating problem. This geothermal can be applied in most countries in some respect. I sometimes get the question, how much geothermal is there? We don't really know it. We just know that it is many times, the energy content of the world's geothermal is many times the energy content of all the world's fossil fuels combined. And geothermal will continue to be replenished as the core of the Earth is still warm or hot. And from cities ranging from Lisbon to Vladivostok, we can do this energy transition. So this could be one of the best SDG projects around the world to change the energy source for cities from fossil fuels to geothermal. And we did this in Iceland long time ago. Now 100% of our space is heated with geothermal. People said to us then, well, you can do it because your country is a volcano. Well, for the last 10 years, we've been doing this also in China, where we are now have started to work in this energy transition in over 60 cities across China. And we are offering this energy under the price of coal heating, under the price of gas heating, no subsidies. It's profitable, so people get the healthy lifestyle, the improved quality of life as a free bonus, because this is cheaper energy. So I believe that Iceland can contribute to other countries reaching SDG goals. Now, if we talk about SDGs specifically, about like SDG 7, which is about clean energy, it's about increasing the mix of renewables as an overall energy percentage. It's about energy efficiency, and it is also about universal access to energy. Geothermal has helped us fulfill all these goals. And also, it applies to other SDG goals because you can use it for heating, for cooling, for electricity, greenhouses, fish farming. So this is not only about energy security, this is also about food security. So this wonderful energy source has transformed our country, and we are eager to share our experiences with our friends around the world.
Thank you. Динара, ну вот вам...
Dinara, you as a representative of the corporate sector would be probably more relevant to ask a question regarding the contribution of the corporate sector in the SDG development. But in general, as a resident of Kazakhstan, I would like you to share your view on the current status and the high objectives that we're declaring now. Thank you. I would like to start with the fact that I'm very much inspired by the goals as such. I keep saying at all the fora that my opinion is that this is one of the most wonderful ideas of this millennium, because the SDGs help to formulate the vision of the future world to be better, to be more sustainable, and how we could make it to leave it for the future generations. As for the corporate sector, I believe that the corporate sector and the businesses should be absolutely involved, because only government or NGOs cannot make it to achieve all those goals. For example, for the objectives to be implemented on an annual basis, the investments totaling $2.5 trillion are required, and the governments don't have this kind of money. A couple of years ago, I was invited to become a member of the Global Sustainable Development Committee, which was based in Davos, and it incorporated 35 global leaders, presidents of major corporations such as Mars and Unilever, and I was honored to be a member. And I started this issue. And during 1 year, we looked at all the aspects. In addition to that, it brings benefit to the community. What else could it give to the business? Because the key objective of the business is to generate income to the shareholders. And during our study, 1 year study, we found out that, in fact, this is quite a profitable investment in the sustainable development. First of all, because it creates the potential market, which we estimated to be $12 trillion at least, and could be even more. We assessed the companies who invest, who are developing their products that are in line with the development SDGs. And these products, these lines of products grow twice as quick as normal products. Shares of the companies that follow SDGs in general are approximately 20%, growing 20% higher at the stock exchange compared to the other companies, and so on and so forth. Therefore, I would like to mention that for the businesses, it does make sense to be involved, and business should do it. But now, how they should do it? I think that, first of all, the businesses should use the 17 SDGs and incorporate them into their strategies at all levels, to appoint the responsible persons for sustainable development, and use the policies within the companies. For example, ensure gender equality, decent payroll, create new jobs, produce the products and services that would not cause any harm to the end users and environment. And also, they should definitely pay all the taxes. And of course, they have to replicate it to their suppliers, and major businesses have tools to impose the SDGs on their contractors and suppliers when they provide their services or produce some goods. Being a resident of Kazakhstan, I can say that last year I joined International Airport of Almaty as a vice CEO, and my first thought was how this could be implemented in practice. And our first project was many of you being here may remember that previously during fogs in Almaty, the planes wouldn't land, and they had to use other airports such as Bishkek and Jambul, and they had to wait, and there were great delays, and they had to wait for the fogs to disappear, or they could transport the passengers by buses. This was very inconvenient, and the most important is that we did the estimate, and we evaluated, and we saw that it damaged the environment, because every time the plane would go to the other airport, they will burn additional 2,000 tons of fuel. Therefore, we thought that we should invest in equipment increasing visibility during the landing. And we did the calculation, and we found out that we save 30% of emissions. And I said, let's position our airport as the first green airport in Kazakhstan, and even probably in CIS. We presented this to our colleagues in UNDP and DAMU, and we received financial support. We acquired equipment of about $2 billion. And if you have noticed, no plane has been moved to other airport during fog. This is what we implemented in practice, and this is not our last project. We are now planning to shift the focus to using electric cars to transport luggage, to transport cargo. And also recently we started a new cafe with healthier food. Therefore, when you visit our Almaty airport, you can try that food. And in general, I believe that we are quite well off. And we are one of the leaders, at least in the Central Asian region, regarding SDG implementation. And we have to look forward and to continue our work. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Dinara. Probably you heard about greenwashing phenomenon when the major companies catch up with this agenda to become more responsible. But if you look in detail, those declarations have almost nothing to do with the reduction of emissions and so on. And there are examples of big companies such as Volkswagen that deliberately confused their clients and community regarding the real damage to the environment. And if we do the same for Kazakhstan, and we do this exercise and carry out the ranking of the companies in Kazakhstan who pollutes more and who pollutes less, and we can see that the biggest polluters their policy in regards to the emission reduction is at a very low level. Now we are developing the new environmental code, and we can see the major opposition to the initiatives of environmental associations when we are talking about increasing the penalties for environmental pollution. And there is an opinion that the corporate sector may not be that responsible and committed, and one of the possible solutions could be the very strict policy of the government. And I liked very much the ideas of Paul Romer during the panel session, that one of the threats could be the weak government in various aspects, and in particular their weakness to oppose the lobby of major corporations which lobby their interest in damaging the interests of the society. What do you think about it? I fully support that we have to continue this work, and this is what we did when we were members of the committee. We followed one of the principles that we should not only deal with our own companies, but insist on our counterparts in other major businesses to start implementing those principles. For example, the president of our committee, Paul Polman, is the CEO of Unilever, and he is a leader in the Paris Agreement as well. He participated in that a lot. So he committed that when he talks to the CEOs of the major corporations, because he has direct access to convince them to change their mindset, to follow the SDGs, and in particular in relation to the environment. And in fact, I think the things are changing, and you may be right that Volkswagen most probably underestimates what is happening, but I recently visited Davos, and there is a great change like 3 years ago. In this year it was agenda number 1, and I can say that people do change their mindsets. This will not happen overnight. It will take some time, but we don't have any way out but to come to that, in particular major corporations.
To Mirjana about the fears of the weak government and the government that should be tougher, and about the discussion in this triangle: society, corporations, business, and the government, in order to achieve sustainable development goals, because the government is under pressure from both sides. First, it's social needs, they need jobs, and we see the experience of France with the yellow vests. Then they tried to pursue the agenda, taxate, and they received rights. And from in our side, it's corporations. There seems to be reluctant to go further.
Thank you. I want to ask a question back. What is a tough government, and what makes a government tough? And I think this is the question we have to start with. When I spoke about strong institutions, then I meant strong institutions in the sense that they design policies in a way that are acceptable and comprehensible to its population and to its private sector. So what the Agenda 2030 means is that this be a collective undertaking. I think neither the government alone, nor the private sector alone, nor civil society alone will be able to implement it. So what we are helping the government with as UNDP is to design these platforms and innovation labs to make sure that these actors come together, and that they, through research and data-based analysis, through bringing technology into the equation, which we have seen impressively with the example of Iceland, to identify the benefits, the collective benefits for everybody, for the private sector and for the society as a whole. And the society is part of the private sector again. We have to agree on where we have to invest as a state. And if it's human development, then it's human development. And if it's education, then it has to be education. But this discussion will make it acceptable for everybody that the government goes into a certain direction. So it has to do with strong institutions, but it also has to do with good governance. The other thing about the SDGs is implementation, as I said before, at all levels. So you can't just do it at the policy level. You also have to go down to the municipal level at the same time. This is something where you actually notice what the sustainable development goals are. I recently had a discussion with a senior member of the German government, and she said the same thing to me. Coming from a rich country and coming from a country that is doing a lot to implement the SDGs. She said it's very difficult to translate the SDGs into concrete action on the ground at the municipal level. But once you've done it, it makes sense to everybody living there because it generates improvements for everybody. And this translation has to happen. UNDP is struggling to translate the Agenda 2030 down to that level, but we do it. We continue to find measures, we continue to design new ways of working, and we continue to introducing a paradigm shift into cooperation. Cooperation is not about donors going to development countries. Cooperation nowadays is about governments themselves standing up and saying we want to implement this in our own countries, and if it worked in our own country, we will go to the others and we will share that best practice. Thank you.
Okay, changes comes from strong institutions. Есть всем известная книга.
There is a well-known book, Why Nations Fail, which speaks about inclusive institutions, extrusive institutions. However, it doesn't provide any obvious recipes on how to achieve strong institutions. And this is a topic for another big discussion. Tatiana, the platforms that you have been involved in and your organization has been involved in, these could be some of the elements of institutions that would help organizing the dialogue in this triangle between the community, government, and corporations. Based on your experience, could you discuss the evolution and what kind of goals these institutions can reach? In my view, in Kazakhstan, we have very well-established civil society. It is strong, it has its own policy, it has clear and well-proven strategies as to how to consolidate with the administrative capacity, starting from the local, regional level and up to the level of the ministries and agencies, and this is great. We established this institution, and it's good that we did it with the assistance of the international institutions, and it was very challenging. But again, coming back to the Planet platform, this is the platform that allows us discussing the Sustainable Development Goals and contribute to its development, and we realize that they are further promoted. I quite often visit the local regions and meet not only with the civil society, but also teachers, parents, and with different communities. And I believe that today the most important is the ability to listen and to understand each other. And only in this case we can speak about promoting not only social reforms and business, because business needs to be promoted, because this is the civil society and people can see the support with the relevant technologies and with a proper vision, and that can, with proper application, can provide the synergy that would help promoting actively the SDGs in Kazakhstan. And I believe that the society is now mature and we are prepared to cooperation with business and government in promoting our common goals. Thank you very much, Tatiana. The time of our session is elapsing, and I would like to thank you for your participation and ask the audience to join me in the course of applause. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to give the floor to the moderator of the next session, Mr. Yerlik Karajan, CEO of the Institute of Economic Research.
Уважаемые коллеги, у нас ряды редеют, предлагаю чуть поближе.
Dear participants, I'm asking everybody to move closer to the stage because we are becoming fewer. We are losing some people.
Nice to see that you're still here and not anyone tired anymore with the third session that we have a challenge to deal with. But actually, I think it's a very interesting one. SDGs is a big platform which covers many aspects of basically of what we do in our life. And the social aspect of that is very important. For me, it's a great honor today to greet our good speakers. We have 4 guests coming from almost every part of the world. So we have, for the third session, when we talk about the social development, I have 4 guests. First is Åsa Regner. She is the Deputy General Director of UN Women. I'll introduce you later on with more details, if I may. We have a very interesting, at least for me personally, speaker who I try to follow on YouTube. She's the ambassador for SDGs, one of the 17th, 17th. She's the global ambassador for the Sustainable Development Goals, Ala Murabit. Please welcome. We also have Susanna Arapityan. She's the coordinator for the human capital development in Central Asia of the World Bank, right? And which is also my pleasure to see Asiat Ahmadiev, who represents the Green Tal, which is a local initiative to support those people with disabilities in Kazakhstan. So we'll have a special case to consider. So I'll be sometimes switching into Russian and to English, but I'll try to keep into to English mostly. But firstly, Åsa, if I may, you have a very interesting background, right? You've been working. You come from Sweden. You've been working in UN Women since May 2018, so it's around 1 year, right? Today, 1 year. Congratulations. So before I go further in details, can you share your views on how's it going?
I humbly think others should judge that, but I'm very privileged. I love my job. It's actually my dream job, so I'm very happy.
Okay. So you worked in Bolivia, La Paz, in the 1990s. You worked in the Ministry of Labor when you worked with the gender issues. And also the social aspects of in your career are very important. I understand that you've been you worked as the minister for the issues of children, elder generation, and the gender inequality in Sweden. Can I have a question for you, if I may? Can you tell us how do you assess SDGs and how SDGs in general, to your personal view, they affect the social life of people?
Thank you very much. Should I do my introduction now, or you
Yes.
sit around a question? Yes, thank you. Obviously, the Sustainable Development Goals cover a large range of issues, and they should be seen together. Gender equality is the goal number 5, but gender should also be part of all goals and all the work that we do. And I think that many of us will realize that when we do that, we will also achieve the gender development goals, the Sustainable Development Goals in general. And UN Women, which I represent, works in 80 countries in the world. And obviously, to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals is an overarching goal for us from the UN side. Kazakhstan is one of the countries where we have a country office, and I'm happy to tell you that we work specifically with SDGs from a gender aspect together with the government of Kazakhstan. But something I want to tell you, I think it's important to know, and Ms. Lagarde talked a bit yesterday about tensions in the current political global climate, and you and I had mentioned something about that as well when we sat here. Today, when you work with gender equality, it's a big privilege to do so, but it's a very contradictory world, to tell you the truth, because on the one hand, we see a lot of member states, many representatives from the private sector, of course a vibrant civil society, supporting, working very hard for gender equality. There is more awareness in the world, there is more knowledge in the world, there is more demand for gender equality from the side of many member states and these other actors. Also, we know more. We have facts around gender equality and its impact on social inclusion, economic growth, labor force participation, and also on peaceful sustainability in peaceful societies. But on the other hand, we also have an increasing number of member states and NGOs who are actually opposing the gender equality agenda. Not only sexual and reproductive health and rights, but the gender equality agenda as such. And that is, it's not a new trend, but it comes through pretty forcefully at the moment. And that means for us that we have to work even harder, we have to be more strategic, and we have to work together, all of us. We really need that. We need governments, we need the private sector, we need organizations, we need men, individual men, who speak about gender equality and stand on the side of women and girls and speak out when you hear some of these not so constructive things being said, both about women and about gender equality and women's rights today. Thank you. It's also important to point out that the support for gender equality can come from member states and organizations in all parts of the world. It's not an issue for the EU or for only Scandinavia or for OECD countries. You can find friendly, supportive, constructive member states, organizations and companies in all parts of the world, as well as you can find resistance within the EU, within the OECD, and in other parts of the world. So it's not so easy to say how this plays out geographically. But we see that nationalism, authoritarian ideas, not least around male leadership, and religious fundamentalism, both Christian and Muslim, come together and have some kind of they come together against women's and girls' rights and the right for women and girls to decide, especially about their own body and their own space. However, we all know that social inclusion accelerates if you work with gender equality and if you also if you're very aware of designing programs from the side of governments, for instance. We recently had this year's Commission on the Status of Women, which is the UN's second largest meeting after the General Assembly every year. This year did strike a record again in terms of participants and also in terms of high level when it comes to the member states' participation, but also NGOs and other experts. This year, the topic was social inclusion, social security, and gender. And many of the member states and the discussions evolved around, and I also want to point out that Kazakhstan was very active this year with its delegation, and they also had a side event around this specific theme. And conclusions from this meeting and discussions is that equality in general, as was spoken about here before, social equality, economic equality, equality between majorities and minorities, etc., is achieved more easily if a special focus if attention is paid to gender equality. Economic growth, we have lots of evidence today that economic growth, use of everybody's education, larger labor force participation, etc., will be accelerated if we work with women's rights and gender equality. The countries will get a larger basis for taxation, income taxes. Poverty reduction is also influenced positively if you work with gender equality, and these were some of the findings from that particular meeting. But it was also pointed out that governments need to put some very important schemes in place. For instance, accessible care, child and elderly care, for both women and men to be able to participate in the workforce. Men are fertile their whole lives. Women have a very small amount of years when they can have children. Still, women are being punished for having children, although these kids have both a mother and a father. So childcare, parental leave, very important schemes for social inclusion. And also one area important that was pointed out is that financing of gender budgeting for these programs is very important. One last point I want to make also when it comes to creating or designing social schemes, if it is for health schemes or social security in general, pension schemes, whatever it is, it's very important to think about the design of these programs. You can either, as a government, design these programs to create autonomy for women as well as for men as individuals with the right to decide about their own lives and their own incomes. Or you can design these programs as actually traps for women more than for men, holding them back in very traditional roles, making them dependent on either the state or an individual man in their life. So the SDGs, as you know, finally is for all countries, and the UN focus on these, obviously, and we from UN Women's side should focus on the women and girls in the most dire situations, in conflict areas, in poverty, in humanitarian crisis. We should leave no one behind. And I'm really happy to be here to discuss this with you today. I believe gender equality is really the solution to a lot of the problems that we have. But we also, all of us, need to step up right now and speak out. So thank you, all of you, for your collaboration with us.
Thank you very much for these comments. If I may, I represent ERI, which is Economic Research Institute. We manage the, we do research. We're a think tank. We're working with the government and also offering with international organizations some services and doing research in various directions. And one of them, and that's very important for us, which is dear to our hearts, is sustainable development. We are the Secretariat for SDGs, in the country, and we have here my colleagues, our colleagues from Kazakhstan, from various agencies and national bodies and NGOs, all here representing various directions of SDGs. And one of them, and of course, gender equality is a very important point. One thing which is my personal experience, recently I visited the Geneva Forum on SDGs for Europe and Central Asia, and I really enjoyed the forum, especially the emotions and the enthusiasm which was shared by the people who were really, with the stars in their eyes, talking about the importance of SDGs. But that coldness, which kind of was lacking in the discussion, was mostly due to the fact that most of the discussions were done by women. And to me, that was a surprise. It was very interesting to see, and I really like these discussions of this kind, and I just wanted to thank you for raising that issue again. In Kazakhstan, we are more or less equal. It is developing very fast, as you mentioned. We have good representation on the decision-making level. We have more or less good history of not much repression, not much issues with gender in the country historically, in our culture in Kazakhstan. However, of course, there are issues. In that regards, if I may allow Ms. Morabit, ask a small question to you first, if you could share your own experience. How come you became the ambassador for SDGs, which is a great role, which is a global ambassador? And I know that you are a very good and enthusiastic speaker. If you could share and come to maybe to the floor there. And secondly, if you could advise on what do you think would be the best advice for Central Asian countries in order to develop the issues of gender equality.
Sure, you want me up?
Yes, if I may.
Why, hello. So I get to speak to you guys before lunch, which is always the best time to talk to people because they are the least awake, and usually looking forward to actually filling up their tummies. I also just genuinely dislike podiums because you can tell that I am 5'2" and not an inch taller, but because our moderator asked so kindly, here I am. You know, I get the luxury of wearing several hats. I am one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goal advocates. Jeffrey Sachs, who moderated the first panel, is another. And I'm also a UN high-level commissioner on health, employment, and economic growth. And a huge part of that is because I am a medical doctor by background. And the reason I so fundamentally believe in the Sustainable Development Goals really actually stems from that. So in order to wake us up a little bit, I am going to ask you guys a few difficult questions, like a pop quiz. And there's no prize except for bragging rights. So we've heard a lot today about climate change. Can anyone here tell me what the most cost-effective solution for climate change is? Most cost-effective and practical solution for climate change? Anyone? No one wants to even guess?
We heard Mr. Sachs talking about trees.
Well, that's not it. What? Gender equality. It's girls' education and women's reproductive rights. Statistically, when we look at the economics of it, it is girls' education and women's reproductive rights. And you're probably wondering why, right? It's a natural assumption. I have a very analytical brain. I come from the sciences. So when I first started getting involved with the Sustainable Development Goals and global politics, a lot of it sounds, no offense, like a bunch of wishy-wash. People say things in a room and then they leave the room and they pass laws that completely disagree with what they just said. People will come into a room and talk about how much they support and respect women, and then they will not ensure women's reproductive rights. People will talk about how much they believe in peace building and security, but then they won't invest in education, right? And so when we find these statistical realities, we have to start asking ourselves, where do they come from? When a girl is educated, what happens? Does anyone know? What happens for her and her family? Feel free to stand up and yell it out. Anyone? She contributes to the economy. So if we educate 10% of the girls in a country, the national GDP goes up 2 to 3%. If we were to equally educate and employ girls around the world, it would be a greater economic growth than China and India combined. That's not a small amount. When we're talking about 1.5 to 3 trillion a year for the Sustainable Development Goals, if we were simply going to educate girls, we have a much bigger budget to transform the world. What else happens when a girl is educated? Anyone? She educates her family. I like it. You just keep answering and we'll pretend it's multiple people. So she creates a cycle of education in her family. She's more likely to vaccinate her kids. She's more likely to get married later. She'll have less kids. They'll be healthier. She reinvests 90% of her income back into her community. How much do men reinvest? Just out of curiosity. Not to put you guys on the spot or anything, but on average. Anyone? What's the guess? Women reinvest 90%. How much do we think men reinvest? 60? 10? Oh, you're either real generous or not at all, huh? 30 to 40%. So when we talk about transforming local economies, it's women. When we talk about feeding local communities, it's women. Now, a huge part of the reason I emphasize this is because when we talk about even this panel, why are the SDGs important for social development? We keep separating social and economic like that's possible, and it's not. When we talk about economic development, if we are not fundamentally talking about reprioritizing where our money is going, we are not going to get anywhere. We cannot simply talk about economic development in silos with corporations and economists at the World Economic Forum or the Astana Economic Forum and act like that is all that's going to work. What we know statistically transforms economies is education, universal health care, and reprioritizing our national budgets. That's what we know. We know that based on education and healthcare alone, you can increase your national GDP by almost 10%. We know that the single greatest economic contributor in a community is not whether or not corporations are paying all their taxes, which they should be, but it's if you adequately educate equally citizens in your society and you prepare them adequately for the job force. So the reason I so strongly believe in the Sustainable Development Goals isn't because they sound good, and isn't because I think the UN should be responsible for championing prosperity and sustainability and equality for everyone. Those are all true. But it's because from an empirical point of view, we cannot do anything else. We cannot continue to sustain global arms trades. We cannot continue to invest in warfare and security and surveillance. We cannot continue to undermine equality around the world, be it gender equality, racial equality, or socioeconomic equality, and assume that the world is going to change. It does not matter how much we invest in renewable energy. It does not matter if we go to Mars. We're just going to continue to replicate the same problems. So I do think the Sustainable Development Goals are the single best opportunity for us as a global collective community to actually do something for once that works. Now, what is my advice to Central Asian? That's a very challenging question because I personally am of the belief that the people who can actually transform their communities are the people from those communities. That's always been my firmest belief. And I think it's actually one of the greatest mistakes we've made as a global community and one of the biggest challenges we have. Oftentimes, projects are thought up of in New York or Brussels or London, and then they parachute in to country X or Y. And they say, our experts, they did this in Kenya, so it must work here in Kazakhstan. Because you guys have some similar religious background and some similar, it doesn't work that way. Countries are fundamentally different. Cities are fundamentally different. We can be 30 kilometers from here and find fundamentally different cultural and social norms. And the people who have the right to be heard the most are the people working in those communities every day. Your local civil society, your local doctors, your local teachers, your local stay-at-home moms, your local fathers. That's who we need to be listening to, and that's who needs to architect the programs here. Experts and consultants and people who have different experiences abroad is great, but it is almost irrelevant in your local context. And I'll give you an example here. There is a heated debate right now happening in the United States about abortion. Very heated debate. Abortion rights are being curtailed in numerous states. There is a sense that this is going to become a national attempt to overturn Roe v. Wade, which is the Supreme Court legislation that legalizes abortion. And I have heard people say, well, this is Republican Sharia, as if it's about Sharia law, which is Islamic law. So this is Republican Sharia. Oh, the South is going Sharia. And this gets repeated and repeated in the media. It's getting repeated by pundits. And it makes me wonder, because Islamically, abortion is permitted. Up until 40 days in all schools of thought, up until 120 days when the soul's considered to enter the body under different circumstances, and even until the last day if it impacts the mother's life. And yet somehow, in an effort to make this conversation palatable, we are undermining our own understanding of faith so that we can somehow be in line with the Republican assumption about women's bodies. To me, it fundamentally doesn't make sense. We cannot copy-paste. There is nuance in everything. And I actually think countries like Kazakhstan and religions like Islam have the opportunity to say, hey, we're pretty good on this. Let us teach you what we've been doing. Let us tell you about our experience. Because the constant belief and assumption that the West is always doing it better, or that we don't have inherent experience and knowledge and skill and legitimacy as leaders, is, I think, something that continues to undermine us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One thing which I didn't mention is that Ms. Morabit is the background is medical, right? But one thing we share, we are both alumni of LSE, London School of Economics. She graduated with a master's degree with distinction, right, in international strategy, which is very strong. In that regards, I really enjoy your advice, that is, do it yourself. But let's share the values, which is very important. Thank you very much. I'll have more questions later on, but I want to share the floor with our next speaker, who's also got some commonalities with you. She's also a doctor by background. So Susanna Erapetyan, you come from Armenia. We had an excellent presentation from your president earlier yesterday. Thank you for that. I just wanted to share my good views on that. And I think that there's good chances that we can work further together, understanding that you have something to say about the human capital development and investment into that. You have some background, so maybe you could tell us more in addition to what we heard from previous speakers.
Thank you very much. Thank you for kind words about my president, but here I represent World Bank. I'm a human development program leader for Central Asia based in Almaty. It's already 2 years that I'm living in Kazakhstan, so almost Kazakhstani. Ladies and gentlemen, after yesterday's rich discussions, I don't think that there is anyone in this audience who needs additional arguments for investing in human capital as a major driver for economic growth and sustainable development. Since politicians often do, because, especially in developing countries, because they are dealing with so many competing demands on a daily basis, and they want quick results, visible results for their population while they are on power. However, investment in human capital doesn't bring quick, immediate results. the long-term results, which are coming from investment in human capital, but they are absolutely critical for preparing future generation to challenges of rapidly growing, rapidly changing world. To advocate for more and continuous investment in human capital, the World Bank last year initiated development of Human Capital Index, which provides close linkages between investment in human capital and productivity. The language actually which understandable for ministries of finance, for prime ministers, because I'm sure you had some experience with the ministries of finance if you work in a social sector asking for money and they would give a preference to investing in infrastructure, for example. I have too. I worked in the Ministry of Health in Armenia, so I had very memorable episodes. So before going to a story about Human Capital Index, let us remind what do we mean when we say human capital. Human capital consists of the knowledge, skills, and health that people accumulate throughout their lives, enabling them to realize their potential as productive members of society. World Bank Human Capital Index measures how much human capital can a child born today expect to acquire by age of 18, given the risks to poor health and poor education that prevails in the country the child lives. It measures health as well as a quantity, but most importantly, quality of education. It highlights how investments that improve health outcomes today will affect the productivity of the future generation. It focuses on the next generation rather than taking stock, measuring the stock of human capital of current generation, because it's a result largely of previous policy choices at previous decades when the current workforce was at school age. Sorry, how can I go back? Away? Okay, so it's a technology issue, but I really want to show the slide. Who can help me with going back? Вот этот слайд я хочу. Yeah, this is the one. Thank you. So the Human Capital Index was calculated using three major components and indicators, of which three at least overlaps or closely links to the indicators of Sustainable Development Goal. And the first component is survival. It uses indicator of under 5 mortality rate and shows that if children do not survive, they don't grow up to become future workers. The second indicator or second component uses quality adjusted years of schooling, not just the years of schooling, but the quality adjusted. And the World Bank has another report on learning crisis, which shows that in many, many developing countries, students attend school, but they don't learn. So the indicator used here is quality adjusted school years to show the contribution of education to productivity. And the health component is a component on health, which uses the adult survival rate and stunting to show contribution of health into productivity of future workers. Okay, I can navigates this. So I'll better talk this way. So the Human Capital Index was developed last year and first was presented at World Bank annual meeting in Bali. It was calculated for 157 member countries and actually was in a way kind of a wake-up call for many countries because it shows that about 60% of children which are born today will be at best half productive as they could be having full education, complete education and full health. So many countries prompted to change their policies to invest in more in human capital. Yesterday, you heard the Prime Minister of Georgia who told us about their decision to increase the public spending on education to almost OECD level of 6%, and I worked in Georgia. It was like barely to 3%, so they decided to double. And this is happening to many countries which saw that their index is not that great that they thought. Let's take example of Kazakhstan, because we are in beautiful Nur-Sultan, to show the index, how index works. Unfortunately, something wrong with this, but I wanted to show you a slide which tells us that in terms of learning outcomes, Kazakhstan is among top 10 countries in the world. I think it's a remarkable achievement, which also contributed to quite high index for Kazakhstan. And I forgot to mention that index is ranging from 0 to 1, and the highest score is assigned to the best performing country, which is Singapore, and shows the distance of other countries from frontier, as I said, Singapore. So what does it mean for Kazakhstan having the score of 0.75? It means that the children born today, if nothing changes, the same level of investment in human capital, the future generation will be 25% less productive compared as it could be with a complete education and full health. But there are good stories also to tell about Kazakhstan. The index for Kazakhstan is higher than for average for its region, and it's higher than average for the income group countries. There is another good news that the index disaggregated by gender is higher for girls than for boys. It tells us about gender equality, but it also tells us the challenges with the human capital in the future. So what Kazakhstan can do and to invest in abolishing the gap between rural and urban cities in terms of qualification of teachers, learning environment, school management. It also can consider increasing public spending on health and education. Still, the level of spending is less than for the country at that income level. I mentioned Georgia, 6% of GDP to education. In Kazakhstan, it's at 3.6% to education and 2.2% for healthcare. So what does it mean globally, this index to the countries? I already mentioned that many countries actually took this seriously to develop their index, to improve their index, and to invest in their human capital. And the World Bank, as a follow-up for this presentation of the index, helps the governments to develop whole of the government approach towards improving human capital, to develop the vision, to develop the strategy, how this can be coordinated among different agencies. Because when we are talking about the human capital, investing in human capital, it's not only in health and education, it's nutrition, it's social protection, water, energy, you name it. So the human capital development needs to adopt this whole of the government vision. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very, very nice and interesting comments. One thing which I really enjoy and actually love about SDGs, that it is forward-looking. It doesn't look much back. It looks into the future. It looks into the particular date, whatever the indexes that they are for each particular of the tasks and objectives that we have in SDGs. In that regards, that positive view, I think, is the best feature of SDGs. And being constructive, looking into a particular point that you want to achieve is something beautiful about SDGs. In that regards, we have my other colleague, whose name is Asiet Ahmadiyev. I'll switch into Russian, if I may. You can just put it on.
Asiet represents the company social workshop, which is called Green Tal. Probably he will tell us a little bit more about it, because it is one of the initiatives on social entrepreneurship, which helps disabled people to get the positive results, some benefits. And SDGs enable us to take a look at the future from a different point of view, from a prospect of future. And sometimes in practice, such issues can be very easily looked out or omitted. And in this sense, disabled people, for example, will get an opportunity to be better integrated into life. And I guess that a company like yours serves a very good example of how it happens in our country and why social entrepreneurship was launched by you and how you appreciate this initiative in general. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for an opportunity for us to be able to express our opinion at a global forum. First and foremost, I really liked the statement of Ms. Murabit when she said that everything depends on every individual, on every person. I don't mean the global organizations or government at large, but it depends on every person. Let me introduce our organization. We are social entrepreneurs in Kazakhstan. Our organization is specialized in resolution of social problems existing in our society, and we do it on our own initiative. Nobody asked us to do so. We simply pick up certain social problems existing in our country, and we decided to try to address them, because our organization is specialized in providing jobs to people from socially vulnerable layers of population. And if, for example, somebody will tell us you represent only 32 people, no, I would say that we have already employed 32 people from vulnerable layers of population. And I would like to clarify who exactly works in our organization. Disabled people work in our organizations, the people who have some physical disabilities, people who don't have their limbs, who have some pathology of their organs. There are some people with mental disorders, for example, suffering from schizophrenia or autism, or people with delayed psychic development. Also, we have mothers left alone, and the fathers who don't have wives and have to bring up their children, and the last category are ex-prisoners. And I believe that it is really very important if all types of businesses which we have in our society today, if they will pay a little bit, just a bit of their attention to social problems, then I believe the world would have been changed for better. Thank you. Thank you very much, Asyet. My question is why? What was the reason for which you have decided to deal with such issues? And why do you think that it requires expansion? First of all, why we have decided to deal with these problems? Because we have seen that there are a lot of people from socially vulnerable layers of population cannot get jobs, cannot get employed. And this is the reason for which we decided not to simply do business, but we have decided to make sure that certain help and assistance will be provided to people in need. Therefore, it was the main incentive for us. And that's how we started it. When I was getting prepared and reading up for this event, what I was proposed is to answer the question whether or not social entrepreneurship is profitable. And here the word profitability or profit is confusing me a little bit, because I do support you, because humanitarian mission is also bringing a lot of value, and therefore I would like to support your projects, and I believe that they have to be expanded. And therefore, Sapar, I wish you all the best, and I wish you success, and then we will try to continue the discussion.
Ask a question. To many, SDGs is a complex but still a unique matter with good idea behind. So people believe in SDGs. So we think that all those 17 goals which have been identified, and we heard very interesting stories earlier today from Mr. Juan Santos, the former president of Colombia. He was involved in developing and working on first drafts of SDGs. And we see it's kind of robust, right? It covers almost every part of our life. But so my question would be to you, as those strong believers in SDGs, can you highlight the challenges to the agenda, and also the opportunities as well? So maybe we can go one by one. Who would volunteer?
Thank you very much. I think that obviously these goals need political will, and especially when it is about shifting power between maybe groups or within society, or to create justice. It's not only that a country needs to first become rich or richer. It's not necessarily so, as you were pointing out, I think, that just because a country has resources or more resources than before, all of a sudden that government decides to spend that on children or abortion care or women's rights. In order to do so, you have to have a political commitment, and many times you also need civil society to push for issues, and then therefore you have to have a dialogue with the civil society and so on. So I think that both the possibility and the challenge is political will. And I think that the discussion here before and earlier has also been a lot about the challenges to politicians. And since I recently was a minister responsible for gender equality and social affairs, also in a country with big budgets for social issues compared to in many other countries, especially if you want to fulfill long-time goals which might cost something short term, it is very difficult to do so in certain circumstances where I also think that social media plays a big role. But I think that political will is the first thing that you have to have, especially if you want to shift power. But you also have to be very skillful to involve, to go before, to involve, to be patient, to find ways to do the good reforms you need, both short-term and long-term. Thank you.
Yes, please.
So I fully agree with that. I think what it comes down to in terms of sustainable development is it is an agenda about power. And I think the biggest challenge is our own hypocrisy and our own lack of accountability. And I say that in terms of both on a global level, but even, with the Millennium Development Goals, the idea behind them was that they were more prescriptive. They were about uplifting countries out of poverty, et cetera, et cetera. And the Sustainable Development Goals were proposed as something that was non-prescriptive. It applied as much to Canada and Sweden as it did to Kazakhstan. The challenge here is, let me frame this in a medical question. So you have a patient come in, and a patient has an infection on their arm. And the infection is pretty bad. If you are a good doctor, what do? You leave it. Okay, well, you're not a good doctor. I mean,
I'm not a doctor, but
what do? So you're going to do a proper history, right? You're going to want to find out what specific infection it is, and then you're going to debride it, which means you're going to go in and you're going to clean it to the bone. It takes time, it takes expertise, but that's the only way that patient doesn't come back in 2 weeks and need to get their arm amputated, right? You have to actually go to the root of the problem. You treat the patient systemically, you also treat them locally with specific expertise, but you do not put a Band-Aid on it and then wait a couple of weeks, and they come back with an arm that needs to be amputated. That's not what you do medically. What we're doing politically, and this is my issue with political will is we have no accountability for it at all. What we're doing politically is we are telling countries this is non-prescriptive agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals are for everyone, we are all responsible for them, but then we are not talking about where the vast majority of our resources are going. We're not talking about the fact that numerous countries allow for tax evasion. We're not talking about the fact that there are entire continents that will never be able to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals because of global inaccountability, global corruption, and global misspending. There are fundamental realities. We have to start asking ourselves, why do we make such a big deal about 1.5 trillion for sustainable development when we're willing to pay 10 times that for global conflict? Because political will is a wonderful thing to say, but to be 100% frank, it means nothing when we cannot hold anyone accountable. So I do think our biggest challenge is accountability, the fact that we do not have those frameworks, the fact that we do not have global institutions that will put them in place, because countries will not sign on to them, because they threaten their own power and their own resources, and our own hypocrisy, because it's very easy to say this is non-prescriptive, but then unfortunately we don't really see much changing at the highest levels.
So then my question is, so who is responsible? Is there a particular party responsible for SDGs who would cover and who will take the burden?
No, and I think we're individually responsible. I think my frustration with the Sustainable Development Goals in terms of the way the agenda has been spoken about up until now is we all talk about partnerships for the goals, Goal 17, and we talk about corporations and governments and ministries and multilateral institutions. That's all great. But what really mobilizes corporations? And who elects governments? And who supports multilateral institutions? It's citizens. And we're completely ignoring the vast majority of citizens from the conversation. We are not making the Sustainable Development Goals accessible. We don't. And I can be blunt about that. If you go to the vast majority of the world has been working on the Sustainable Development Goals. People have been working on gender equality for decades. They've been working on economic growth. They've been working on climate change. This didn't just happen because in New York in 2015, people said the Sustainable Development Goals exist. Civil society, individuals, citizens, mothers, fathers, kids have been working on this for decades. And they're completely sidelined from this conversation because this conversation happens in New York, or we use terms like the Sustainable Development Goals. And we don't actually talk to people about their work they're doing, and we don't emphasize how their work is key to the Sustainable Development Goals. It is the foundation. It is evidence that it works. It's what gave us the data and the statistics. So until we make this conversation personal, until we talk to every citizen, until we make it clear that, I mean, we should not live in a world where 1% has more wealth than 99%. We shouldn't. That should not be something that we allow to even exist through our elections, through our corporate mechanisms. And I think for so long we've been told as citizens we don't have the power, and my hope for the Sustainable Development Goals fundamentally is that people recognize we are the only ones who have the power to actually right this wrong.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Very good comment. Yes.
I will briefly add, when we first at the bank talked about human capital index, there were lots of skepticism. What is this? It's a largely replicates human capital index of UNDP, etc. So it doesn't provide dimension of poverty, many other dimensions. But eventually we thought that it's actually a good idea to provide this linkage with productivity and show how the countries rank, what is the country's major problem in terms of their future generation. And I have to tell you that just after 1 year, the index and the human capital project got such a traction that we started with early adopters, 37 countries, just to look at how they are doing, the statistics, to calculate the index. Now, 60 more countries want to be immediately in the list of human capital project countries, pioneer countries, to develop their whole of the government vision. And I think the major advantage of having that index was advocacy. Advocacy and also, getting the attention, public attention. I agree with my colleague that exactly, so the society needs to own this process, and by sharing this index, making it public, so people ask their government why it is like this, why our kids do not learn when they attend the school, why our children have malnutrition, etc. And then the attention to the issue gets much, much more.
Thank you. Thank you. Хотел обратиться к Асету.
I'd like to ask Aset. You are involved into social entrepreneurship for quite a time, and do you see some certain development? Do you feel like more attention is paid by the society to your work? Well, I liked your comment because you said that you provided jobs to 36 people and many would laugh at it, but you believe that it's a progress. So what's your evaluation? First and foremost, I would like to mention that such enterprises like ours are usually established not for making profit, not to make profit, but to address social problems in the society. The extent to which it is profitable or interesting to invest in our enterprises, and the extent to which the government might be interested in our projects. I believe that the government should really be interested in our projects and in our enterprises. As to the investors, they are not very much interested because, of course, they measure everything in terms of revenues, profits, whereas the main success of our enterprises depends on the resolution of social problems. And I would say that such enterprises notice that our society is now exercising a conscious approach to this because people understand that it is a very good thing to do and to have in the society because it is working for the purpose and for the benefit of SDGs. Because here you see a very clear-cut line when the people are arriving at this conclusion independently, irrespective of the promotion that is undertaken by the government or global organizations. Thank you, Asit, and I would like to join here to this comment. This work, this job actually reflects the ideas expressed by our previous speakers because, as a matter of fact, SDGs should be transformed into a belief of all and everybody. It's a team process because if it's not a team process, you will not be able to achieve a lot. And I would like to thank our speakers for their participation. And before I request our ambassador of SDGs to provide the final comment, I would like to reiterate on the agenda and to remind you of what we have done. Today we conducted the first Kazakhstani Forum on the achievement of SDGs. And it's really a very important event for us, for our country, and it's really great that it took place here at such an international platform as Astana Economic Forum, and I would like to congratulate you on this.
Today we had 3 sessions, and in the morning we heard the Prime Minister, Askar Mamin, who told us how high is the SDG agenda in the agenda of the government. We are facing major tasks, and we expect that in New York in summer the voluntary review on Kazakhstan's SDG will be reported. We, as the Secretariat for SDG, will keep on working on that, and it is extremely important that when we deal with all the stakeholders, not only the public bodies, we have to involve the businesses, civil society, international institutions, and we have to promote those ideas quite seriously, and we will continue working on that. We have very strong plans, and we hope that by the end of the year we will have a clear and well estimated strategy for 2030 as to how we are going to achieve SDGs. And we very much hope that we will not be alone in that process. We will rely upon your help. I would like to express gratitude to our international partners. You see the logos of them on the screen. They include, first of all, Asian Development Bank, who jointly with UN is helping us, helping the government in implementing those ideas. At the national level, we are now promoting the issues of nationalization of SDGs, that is the application of those at the national level with the involvement of all the major stakeholders. But at the same time, our task is to localize those objectives, and localization is the process that is more serious and that has to go not as far as the regions, but even further to every citizen, every member of the community of the country. And I would like to give the floor to our respectful global SDG ambassador to say final words on how we should move forward. What would be your final advice to charge us for the follow-up works?
Thank you. I'm honored. You know, I truly fundamentally believe that the only way we achieve the Sustainable Development Goals is if we each individually take them on in our own lives. And what I mean by that is not that we all need to become SDG advocates or head up UN Women or work at the World Bank, but rather my challenge to you is to think about your daily life, where you work, the spheres in which you have power, because we all have power in our own lives, right? The audiences that listen to you, and the rooms, the decisions that you get to make, the rooms that you get to be in. And my challenge is I want you to think of one person who is not in that room who should be. And I specifically want you to try to think of a woman or somebody who is a minority, someone who is disabled, someone who is purposefully, socially often excluded from those rooms of power. And I want you to ask yourself, what can you do in your individual capacity to ensure that more voices are in that room, that those decisions are more inclusive, and that her voice or his voice is heard? Because if we all individually make the room a bit bigger, make the conversations more inclusive, ensure that people who are often excluded from the conversations are in the room, then the likelihood that these conversations actually last and the likelihood that we can actually achieve the Sustainable Development Goals is so much more realistic. But if we remain exclusive, they just will not work. So I challenge you all, think about it. Who is not in your boardroom? Who's not in your advisory council? Who is not in the room that should be there, that you know deserves to be there and has been excluded? Get them in the room. Share a little bit of your power.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much. We will continue working on SDGs, and today as well, our partners, there is an organization called Enactors. It's an international institution. In the afternoon, they will present their own cases, their projects that they're implementing together with youth. Like our colleagues from Greentown, they're implementing the socially oriented and social investment projects. And I'm inviting you to participate. To all of us, bon voyage to SDGs. Let's promote them. Let's promote gender equality, social equality, economic justice. These are the terms that have to be always in our minds. Good luck to you, and hope to meet you again.